Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you. My name is Elisabeth King. I'm a professor of international education here at NYU Steinhardt, and I also serve as our Vice Dean for faculty. And it is my pleasure to be with you this morning with gratitude to everyone who's joining us in the room and online, and to all of the organizers and supporters of this event as well. So it is my real pleasure to introduce you to our three panelists that we have this morning, who are going to be talking to us about educational exchange, the economy, and diplomacy, and the links between these three dimensions at this particular moment in time. So to my left, to your right, I first present Mirka Martel, who's head of research, evaluation, and learning at the Institute of International Education. I could give you a long bio for each of these individuals. I'm going to do the short version, if you'll allow me. Martel's a recognized researcher and author on international education issues, spanning global academic mobility, international leadership and scholarship, and impact evaluation. And at IIE, Dr. Martel oversees two key resources that you may know as international education practitioners. One maps academic mobility flows in the United States and worldwide. That's the historic Open Doors report that you may have already heard cited in the last day and a half. And the other is Project Atlas Research Initiative on Global Student Mobility. So you'll join me, of course, in welcoming Mirka to NYU this morning. I next turn to our guest on the screen, Jen Miller. Can you hear us, Jen?
I can, loud and clear.
Wonderful, and we hear you equally well. It's terrific to have you here as Senior Advisor for Domestic Outreach and Partnerships at the U.S. Department of State. Miller serves in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. She oversees the United States government-funded university partnerships, diaspora outreach activities, and liaises closely with U.S. foundations and NGOs interested in working in South and Central Asia. She has spent the last decade developing expertise in the region with a focus on international education, corporate engagement, domestic outreach, public diplomacy, one of the key words from our panel, campaign management, and foreign assistance. So we also welcome you, Jen. Even from afar, we feel you in the room here at NYU. And last but not least, I welcome Carolyn Sorkin, and I say re-welcome. Carolyn Sorkin has a specialization in higher ed for over 30 years and has led University Passport, where she is the president, since 2014. She specializes in developing students' writing, research, and communication skills, key both during the application process and then throughout their education. Sorkin earned a number of degrees, but I'm just going to focus on one of them, which is, of course, the PhD in education from NYU. So welcome back. Welcome to all three panelists. We talked a little bit in advance of the panel about our themes, and I thought it might make sense to start by asking each of you to spend maybe just 2 or 3 minutes telling us about what you do and then how it relates to the title of our panel today, focused on these exchange programs, economy, and person-to-person diplomacy. Mirka, should I put you on the spot first? Please.
Well, thank you so much, Elisabeth. Thank you for the introduction. I think the easiest way for me to have a connection to any of these themes is through data. I oversee the Open Doors report on international educational exchange, which many of you in the room hopefully know and use as a resource for international student and scholar mobility flows to and from the United States. Many of our exchange programs are, of course, represented in our data, which is the most comprehensive resource for these types of mobility flows. So first and foremost, I think it comes from that data angle and that research angle around how we map the trends and how that can both, how it can reflect where exchange programs are happening, but also how it can inform exchange programs, because often we'll see that when we have emerging international student markets, we know that at that time or as institutions and organizations plan, they often then look at these type of data to understand how their exchange programs will be planned. And I think, of course, the connections to public diplomacy and economy are just so strong. International students are incredibly strong contributors to the U.S. economy. Our U.S. study abroad programs contribute to other countries. So I love to study this link between economy and diplomacy as somebody who studied international politics. So I'm really looking forward to having that discussion today.
Good. Thank you so much. And let me also say that I see some of my former students in the room, and we did this class called Mapping International Education here at NYU. I see some fond smiles. And the basis of your data and your reports inspired us to think about how we want to and how we could potentially understand and then visualize, right, this international student mobility in both directions. So thank you for your inspiration. I am going to go to Jen next, Carolyn, but we won't always go in the same order. We'll make sure to mix it up. But Jen, if we could turn to you with the same question, just to tell us a little bit about what you do and how it relates to our panel themes by way of kicking us off.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for allowing me to join from snowy Washington, D.C., apparently. So immediately after completing NYU's India Global Perspectives in Higher Education Study Abroad back in 2010, I had the privilege of joining the State Department as a then unpaid intern and joined the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, working on English language programs in South and Central Asia. It was my dream job. I had studied India at NYU. I was thrilled. And I've spent the last 15 years working in different capacities across the department, focused on international education and public diplomacy initiatives in South and Central Asia, both from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs and now from the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, which is home to about a quarter of the world's population. In my current role, I have two prime responsibilities. First, creating opportunities for U.S. constituents to engage with senior policymakers at the State Department with the goal of ensuring foreign policy towards Central Asia accurately reflects the priorities of American taxpayers. This is a relatively new position within the State Department. I think something that we have been lacking on for a long time, and I'm thrilled that we're expanding it and more getting out there so that we can explain what foreign policy is to folks. Oftentimes that involves a lot of engagements across the United States with universities who are benefiting from international students coming into their programs, as well as setting up university campuses overseas. The second part of my job is I chair the Private Sector Engagement Committee on the U.S.-India Education and Skills Development Working Group. This working group was launched in 2023 with the goal of enhancing cooperation and collaboration between the U.S. and India in the fields of education, research, skill development, et cetera. This committee that I chair, I seek to be able to leverage private sector resources and expand the research happening, student flows happening, as it is the private sector primarily that benefits from the flow of international students with like the best minds in the world. And so I seek to help them make greater access for more students through scholarships, fellowships, and things like that. Over.
Thank you, Jen. And my apologies that I did not also highlight your deep connections to our NYU International Education Program. Thanks very much for this start. And there's lots already to begin to unpack because both of you have talked about politics and foreign policy. And that's not always what we think about when we talk about education. Let me go next to Carolyn, and then we'll come back.
So thank you for the invitation, and it's lovely to be in such august company. My background is a little more varied, I think, having fallen in love with international education when I studied abroad in Spain on a program where most of the students were from Latin America. I came back to college and ultimately took a job on the board of admission at Brown University. And after the first year, the person who was in charge of international admission took a job with the Foreign Service and left a little bit abruptly. And they offered the job to all the senior people in the office, but no one wanted it because it meant teaching themselves the secondary educational systems of about 80 countries at the time. And I thought that sounded like manna from heaven. So raised my hand, jumped up and down a little bit, and was in that position for a few years. Went back to school, did a master's degree in international education at Stanford University, focusing on development, and then moved to Chile, where I worked in educational exchange for 2 years. All great jobs, wonderful experiences. Came back to the US, and after a brief stint at the United Nations, I worked at NYU as associate director of the King Juan Carlos Center, which is a center for research and teaching on the Spanish-speaking world. And while I was there, I did my PhD in the international education program. Moved on to Wesleyan, where I was director of international studies and most of the international fellowships for about 11 years, and then decided to leave academia. A little hard to say that in this audience, but left academia to move into the private sector, opened University Passport, where I help students, both domestic and international students, to find colleges, universities, graduate programs that will allow them to advance their own careers.
Thank you. You can see already such a wealth of experience and so many threads beginning to pop up across. I wonder how many of us, if you haven't already done this in the room, have studied abroad personally, as this being a key part of our trajectories in this field. How many? Fascinating, right? Pull these themes together on the panel. In the description of the panel that you received, you would have heard that today's international exchange programs, such as the Fulbright program, were launched during or shortly after World War II with the purpose of improving intercultural relations, cultural diplomacy, and intercultural competence between the United States and other countries. You'll also see in the description of the panel that my colleagues kindly put together that these exchange programs sponsored by the US government contribute nearly $40 billion to the US economy and support nearly 400,000 jobs. And so we're picking up these themes. I asked our panelists a little bit of a tough question to boil it down to one story. Right? So to think about those of us in this room as believers in the power and the promise of education, probably most of us already sold on some of the key tenets in the panel description. So to think about one story of why you think educational exchange is important for public diplomacy and or for the US economy. Shall I mix it up and go to someone different this time? Carolyn, are you eager to start? Excellent.
So I thought long and hard about this because, as you can imagine, we all have many stories that would reflect this. But it happens that yesterday morning at 7 a.m., I was on a call with a parent who was really struggling because her daughter was writing a paper about the Emperor Nero and Nero's love of the organ. And she said, I just can't understand what she's going to find to praise about Nero. This parent was from China, and this was a history paper. And I said, the goal of the history paper is not to praise the emperor, but to look at his reign and how he got to power and what he did with power and so on. And it's fine to do that with a critical eye. She said she just couldn't quite imagine that. So we spent a lot of time talking about the value of exploring history with a critical eye. And by the end of the conversation, it was a long conversation, but at the end of it, she began to imagine that there was value, not just in putting someone up as a role model, but in actually thinking about what lessons we might gain from things they might not have done in ways that we would like.
Thank you. And that works in every direction. I'm going to go to Jen next, and then I'll come back to you, Mirka. Jen, what story do you want to share with us?
Sure. So I spent 6 years in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And during that time, I had the pleasure of directly implementing English language programs across South and Central Asia. We hear a lot about programs like Fulbright, which are really, targeting the best, the brightest, the most privileged students across the world oftentimes. But ECA has over 100 different programs to meet all sorts of different audiences. The one that was closest to my heart was the English Access Micro Scholarship Program. And this provided after-school English language lessons to bright but significantly disadvantaged students across the world. And oftentimes the sort of best and the brightest out of that community will come on an exchange program. One young woman who I met at the 10-year anniversary of the Access program was named Seema, and she was from a state of Odisha in India. And she is from a tribal community which are disadvantaged across India. And this young woman had gotten herself into the Access program, learned English, come on a study abroad program to the US, then returned and went to medical school. She has so significantly lifted up her community that she returned to and was at the forefront of treating COVID patients during the pandemic. And seeing the benefit of one of 100 different programs that are reaching hundreds of thousands of students a year, and how she has used that to expand access to high quality medical care in her tribal community in India is something that I always look back on. And if she can do that, we can do just about anything. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Goosebumps, right? Mirka.
So my story, again, goes back to data. I can't help myself.
We welcome it.
The Open Doors report celebrates 75 years this year. And what we do with that data is we look at all those trends historically, and when there are blips in data. For those of us who are analysts, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for what are those changes that happened over time. And one of the biggest blips in our data, and Alan will be okay if I say this, the biggest blips in IIE's data is our data on Brazil in the 2010s. And it's because of a program that was the Brazil Scientific Mobility Program. Many of you probably know that program. It was a great program that was set up for undergraduate students in science, technology, engineering, and math to come and study here for their undergraduate degrees in thousands. And I don't know if NYU was one of the hubs, but there were many institutions that were affected by this. And IIE was affected by it because we actually were one of the largest providers, and we were kind of placing all of these students. So our numbers in those years spiked in terms of the grantees we supported. So I talk about that on the IIE side, but on the Open Door side, we saw these huge spikes in numbers from Brazil. A year ago, I was on a Latin America panel with Ahmad Ezzedine, great contact, one of Sharif's close colleagues, who is the senior internationalization officer at Wayne State University. It was also one of the hosts of a large number of Brazil undergraduates. And I talked to him and I said, what's going on? What are you doing? And he's like, well, we're having this really fascinating thing that's happening right now. All those undergraduates who came to visit as undergraduates are now reaching out to us because they want to come again as graduate students, or they want to send their family or friends, or they've encouraged because of their experience and what they went through as students. So either they want to come back and do a master's or a PhD now that they are a bit older, or they're interested in studying so that they can get OPT, so that they can get global career opportunities. That initial international education experience has now propelled them to think about that global career pathway, which is what we see and what the data also shows us. And so he was talking about what he was calling a boomerang effect. This idea that students who came as undergraduates are going to be globally mindful, they're going to be globally focused, and either to the same institutions, because he said many of them just write him because they remember him from their time as undergraduates, or to other institutions, have that globally focused mindset. So it's fascinating to me because he said, and that's why we're going to start to see our Brazil grad numbers go up. And so it's fantastic. And it's exciting for me as a data scientist to be able to look at those data trends, but see the stories behind them.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thinking about all those hands that went up when we just said, how many of us have our own international education moment, studying abroad or in some kind of educational exchange that was formative? It's moving from these stories, all of them that speak to this idea of the promise of international education. Now let's move maybe to some of the challenges. So it is a particular moment in time. And there are many reasons in thinking about post-pandemic and the economy and politics. From your perspective or the perspective of your organization, can you talk about some of what you think are the pressing issues in the US landscape for educational exchange today? And we haven't gone to you first yet, Jen, so why don't we turn to you?
Sure, thanks. So in my job, I spend a lot of time thinking about how the US can recruit and retain students to support our critical and emerging technologies industries. One industry in particular is the reshoring of semiconductor manufacturing here in the United States, which is supported by a 2022 CHIPS Act that provided $280 billion towards this effort. So what this means essentially is across the United States, fabrication centers will have to be constructed. They'll have to be designed for specific chips. And these, of course, chips go into every single technology item that we're using these days. And then they'll need to be maintained and run consistently to meet the needs of, U.S. industry and supply, consumer demand. Unfortunately, in the US, with the advent of computer science 50 years ago, we have seen a reciprocal decrease in electrical engineering programs across the United States, a 90% reduction in electrical engineering students coming out of master's and PhD programs in the US. And as we're looking suddenly to hire a whole lot of electrical engineers, we don't have them here. And so I am looking at the challenge of how do we, the United States, attract the students who will be the workforce through STEM OPT, through the H-1B program in the future, et cetera, to create this critical technology for United States security and economy and everything else that we do. I look to countries like India, which was announced this week is now our #1 sending country to the US. I think is 330,000 Indian students are coming here each year, and they are supporting and populating many of our advanced technology degree programs to a great extent. I think I saw a statistic that 90% of US PhD programs in engineering would be financially dissolved if we didn't have international students coming to them. So they're not just filling our needs of the workforce, but they are maintaining our educational institutions. I think one challenge that we will face is the United States education, sector is very, very expensive. We have to compete with the Europeans, the Australians, the Canadians, and try to convince these students that they want to pay, $50, $60, $70, $80,000 a year for an education in the US. And I think that as these costs continue to rise, we have a harder time making that pitch. And so that is one challenge that I see of how can the US education system become more affordable so that we can continue to attract the talent that is essential for our critical and emerging technology industries.
Elizabeth, is there any way I can go next?
Yes,
Because
and
her two challenges were mine.
And
so
I
I'll
just want to
build
say
on
to
them.
Jen, I don't know if you can see the room. Everyone is taking notes, so I feel like you're going to get follow-ups. Please, Mirka, go
And
ahead.
I feel like Jen took my two answers, so I'm just going to follow up and double click on both of her points, because that's exactly what I was going to focus on. I think I'll go in reverse, so I'll pick up on her second point first. International students contribute $50 billion to the US economy. According to the US Department of Commerce in 2023, over half of that contribution or those contributions were personally financed, 55%. Most of the students, over half of the students who come to the US to study, are self-financing their education. It means that they are spending their personal funds, and it means that they need to plan for that. It means that they are, it is a large commitment that they are making. And one of the things we have to really commit ourselves to is ensuring that we support international students, that our institutions do, that our government does. And this is particularly going to be critically important as we try to diversify where international students come from. International students who come from different countries have different economic realities. And not all international students who are coming from our 210 places of origin can afford the price tag of our US education system. And if we are to push on diversity and say, you know, we want more students from sub-Saharan Africa, we want more students from Latin America, we have to be able to rise up to that challenge of the reality that they are more cost averse than some of the other students who come to the US. So looking at things like our 2+2 models, which are really attractive, looking at community college options, looking at scholarship options, institutions being really forward to work with foreign governments and with institutions and parents to think about how they can offset cost. I was on a panel with Colorado State, and the amazing things that they're doing with students in Colombia, where they pay a third, the parents pay a third, and the government of Colombia pays a third. So these really innovative ways that we can think about how to help with cost of the US education, because most students come here because of the quality of our education. But we also see that US institutions report to us that if there are decreases in international students at their campuses, it's because of cost. It's the number one. I often get asked about safety and security. I often get asked about the political system. Yes, those are important, and yet cost is always the number one issue that I'm told. And then the second is innovation and retaining talent, and the particular role that optional practical training, or OPT, is beginning to play. So we had the largest number of students on optional practical training, or OPT, in the US this past academic year, over 240,000. And the number went up by 22% last year. What's happening is we have a large growth in international graduate students coming to the US. That's master's and PhD students. And the vast majority of those students want a career experience. So OPT, STEM OPT, is really attractive to these students. So it is not necessarily a challenge, it's a challenge and an opportunity, because we have to focus on making sure, to Jen's point, that we're focusing on what are the desires of these students, what kind of skills are they looking to get, how can we ensure that those OPT opportunities are out there, how can we ensure that we're trying to find those pathways to employment, which are often not easy. This gets into some sticky issues, but we have to consider that a reality. Most of the students who are coming here do want that OPT experience, and I don't even mean grad students, it's undergrad students too. And we asked this fall institutions about the value of OPT. The number one reason, 77% told us that the highest value of OPT is attracting talent, to Jen's point, to the United States, international talent, particularly when there are gaps in our industries. 84% of those institutions also told us that if OPT was not available in the United States, they think that those international students would look elsewhere and go elsewhere. So the risk, and many of you have seen it in the last year, of OPT, and if anything happened to it, would be a massive risk to our industry as well.
Thank you very much. Carolyn.
So my current work is really much more on the micro level. And so I want to bring in another point that might be interesting to those of you who are thinking about working in universities with international students or working in study abroad. and that is orientation. So a lot of students come into the US at the undergraduate level, their colleges do a couple of days of orientation and whoop, they're off with everyone else. Graduate students generally don't get that in terms of being international students in the US. And I find that when I get back in touch with students that have worked with me who are now undergraduates or graduate students, and I ask them about their experience, their friends are often from their home country. Their friends at their universities in the US are often from their home country. And other than classes and the cafeteria and so on, they're frequently speaking their home language. So there's not as much exchange going on as perhaps there could be. And so one thing I would recommend that we think about is ways to integrate international students at both the undergraduate and graduate levels into their communities, their university communities, the towns or cities in which those universities are based. And I would say the same thing for American students going to study in other countries. It is often the case that that a student goes abroad and doesn't choose to or doesn't know how to really integrate into the local community. And I believe that's a very important part of international exchange. You can't necessarily understand a culture if your interaction with it is somewhat superficial. So for those of you that are heading in that direction, I would encourage, for instance, year-long activities to orient and integrate students into the university communities.
Thank you. A number of threads to pick up on here. One of the things that you said, Mirka, was something that I often hear. So both you and Jen pointed to affordability as the number one challenge, at least top two in terms of challenge. One of the things we often hear is more like, well, it's negative perceptions of the United States that might be affecting the attractiveness of international education folks coming here. Is there anything you want to say, any of you, to that question?
I am always surprised that that is not so much of an issue. There are parents who ask about safety and security, not as many students, but some. They may decide that Baltimore is a dangerous city, so they don't want to go to Johns Hopkins, or LA is dangerous, so they don't want to go to USC, or New York is dangerous, although NYU often is enough of a draw anyways. But I generally do not find students or their families as concerned as I would expect about political differences, cultural differences, even safety and security.
Thanks for that insight. Anything else, Mirka or Jen, on this question?
I mean, same here. I think we've done quite a lot on this. Every fall in our fall snapshot, we ask institutions if their numbers went up, why they went up, if their numbers went down, why they went down. And again, as I mentioned, cost has by and large been the biggest issue. If anything, I think in the past, there's been other, or even more recently, there's been questions about visas and visa delays, but I really do think international students are quite focused on that academic experience, which, if anything, U.S. institutions can help with. They can tell that story. And one of my colleagues in the field who's at a university in Maryland said, our job as an institution is to explain to that international student what their life will be like on our campus. Our campus is not going to represent all of the United States, but we want them to understand what their life will be like on our campus, what their experience will be, how welcome they will be. So I do think that international students get a lot of that, and I think many of them are really focused on that academic experience.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll just quickly mention this past year, there were a number of high-profile deaths of Indian and Indian origin students in the United States. I think it was, about 10 or so that really hit the Indian media hard and horrified Indian parents because there was concerns that somehow Indian students were, somehow under a greater threat than other students in the United States. Looking back at the individual cases, some strains came out of things that were definitely impacting this community. Mental health was something that we had a couple of really terrible situations where students committed suicide or abusing substances and things like that. And I think a lot of it can come back to mental health of international students when they're coming to the US and they are overwhelmed and they're going through culture shock. And for whatever reason, this hit the media very, very significantly in India. We had parents calling us, parents calling the Indian embassy here in Washington. And so we made a really concerted effort to improve and expand our engagement as the US government to Indian students across through our consulates and through Ambassador Eric Garcetti to try and best prepare them for what they were walking into in the US. And we also had a lot of conversations on US campuses about how we can partner together to try and make sure that students get the help that they need when they need it. They know it exists and they have support networks. And I hope very much that we will see less incidents of that in the coming year. But that is certainly a challenge. And I think it's not necessarily unique to the US. It's any student traveling overseas for the first time away from family can fall victim to that.
Thank you for that, Jen. That leads me a little bit into something I wanted to pick up from Carolyn as well, is that I've noticed a number of our comments in terms of our stories and in terms of challenges reflect mostly international students coming to the United States and thinking about the economy here. And perhaps a little bit less, we've talked about the public diplomacy and the gains in having folks come here. Do you want to say in terms of challenges, also thinking about going the other way? Mirka saying study abroad or just international exchange writ large from students based in the United States and where they might go. Carolyn?
So one thing I would just point out is that while I think the largest percentage of students coming into the United States are graduate students, Americans going to study in other countries are mostly undergraduates. Even with undergraduates that are coming to the United States, they tend to come for the full degree. Our students tend to go, well, it used to be for a year abroad, then it was a semester abroad. Now it's often a summer experience or a 2-week study trip as part of a course that they're taking. And so I'm concerned that Americans don't get enough exposure to other countries, other cultures, other societies. And our system is set up really to support that. I am beginning to see some high school students in the US think about studying in another country. But in general, we have a lot of really wonderful universities in the US. It's very comfortable to stay in a country that you know or that is yours, where your family is, and so on. But I think that it would behoove the US to have deeper interactions, faculty as well, but I think even at the undergraduate level with students going to spend several years elsewhere and learn about other societies through their education.
Yeah, thank you so much for these important points. Mirka, did you want to
Yeah,
add?
I see Carolyn's been studying our data. That's really good to see. She's been studying that study of raw data. So indeed, those numbers have been getting shorter. We do see that students over time have been more interested in short-term study abroad. Just in terms of the sheer numbers, I think the biggest shock, much like to inbound to outbound, was the COVID-19 pandemic. This year we had numbers go up. We have, by another 49% or so. The latest data we have is on the 22-23 academic year when most study abroad programs were reopening, but those numbers are not back to pre-pandemic numbers by any means. And so there is more work to do here. Study abroad is an incredible experience. I think there is plenty of data that many of you have probably looked at about the inherent value to students who study abroad, both in terms of their skills, but also then in terms of their careers when they finish school. So I think that there's a value here economically in terms of the value of study abroad, but there is also definitely this value of cultural diplomacy. And oftentimes when we look at the value of study abroad, we're looking at the value of those students going and studying in other countries, the global mindset that they are gaining, the global ambassadors that they are, both on exchange programs and otherwise for the United States to a certain extent. So I think it is important. Those numbers are still going up, and I agree that we need to continue to focus on that as a priority.
Thank you. Jen, is there anything you want to say on this one?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. This is something that we really struggle with in South and Central Asia. The universities across the region are currently developing their ability to host international students. So we have different programs that are helping them to increase the professionalization of their global affairs offices within their universities. I'll also mention that the State Department thinks this is really important to get more US students overseas to learn critical language, to understand other cultures, and to build those connections. We have a number of different scholarships that will provide, which I wish I'd known about, $5,000 to $8,000 just to go study abroad. You can apply for this money and go pretty much anywhere and use it on any different study abroad. It's just a grant to you to do it. But if you happen to also be learning a critical language, Urdu, Hindi, Mandarin, etc., we'll give you additional money. We'll give you up to $8,000 to stay and study those languages that we believe are international security interests, to have a community in the United States that can speak these languages and be potential future diplomats, working within the government or within the private sector. I'll just give a quick shout out to both the Gilman program and the Bourne program. They both target disadvantaged American students. And so please make sure that your students are aware of our scholarships that they can apply for to get those first generation students overseas, to increase those language learning opportunities with native speakers. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm so glad you named some of the specific programs too, because I would have come back to you. This is a captive audience who can share meaningfully opportunities with a wide group of students. Jen, we often come to you last, so let me come to you first on this question. We've named a number of challenges in terms of affordability, in terms of structures, talked a little bit about perceptions in regards to safety and support for students here, as well as just us having raised this challenge of students from the United States going abroad for shorter and shorter periods of time. Do you want to pick maybe one of those challenges and suggest what we might do about it?
Yeah, so I think as we look toward both recruiting international students as well as reducing the cost, there's a lot that can be done in partnership programs. Earlier, the 2+2 programs were mentioned. We are working through this working group to try and set up programs for Indian students that partner universities that have similar degree qualifications for the undergrad degree in India and then a master's degree in the US, so that they only need to spend one full calendar year in the United States, because oftentimes they're coming in with extremely strong background in STEM industry, in STEM fields, and then they are qualified to go to these master's programs, get it done in just 1 year at a much reduced cost, and then still qualify for those STEM OPT programs that allow them to work for another 3 years here in the US. And by doing so, we're potentially cutting the cost of an education in half, and then still providing the opportunity to pay back the loans that families are taking through the STEM OPT programs. I would love to see more partnerships like that. We have a new course through the University of Denver that international universities can use, particularly, and it's focused on India, to help them get ready to partner with American universities to set up programs like this, because the expectations are not always similar. So that's one solution that I'm looking at, but I can't make any university do anything. So when you all head back to your home institutions or onto your next positions, please consider programs like this to attract another tier of students into your universities. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Who wants to go next in picking up a challenge and making a case? Mirka.
I mean, I think what I'll focus on, and I whenever I talk about this, I know the numbers are optimistic, but there really are headwinds that are coming, and I think that it's really important to not get complacent. The numbers have been great and they've been growing, but I don't think it means that we should be stopping what we're doing and just kind of resting on this idea that international students will continue to come to the United States. There is real global competition there. We know that. We know it in the top hosts that have been recruiting larger and larger numbers of international students. We also know that in many of these countries, their domestic international higher education systems are going to get stronger, as we've seen in countries in Asia. So I think one of the things to be mindful of is to acknowledge this growth and to talk about how we continue that moving forward. So what's most important? It's making sure that we know that the US has the capacity. We've been seeing this issue that's been happening in Canada, in the UK, even in Australia around capacity. So how do we work with our institutions to make sure that they maintain capacity? But can I just say capacity is not capacity? And by that I mean, some of our grad programs are actually have less and less capacity. Our undergraduate programs have more and more capacity. So again, you start to look at that data and we say, okay, how can we work with institutions who want to increase the number of international students to explore capacity in fields of study where they have it, in undergraduate programming. So again, looking at data and informing how we do that. We're seeing these restrictive policies in Canada, the UK, and Australia. We think that there is an opportunity here. But do we think that it's an absolute given that these students are going to come to the US? I don't think we should. I think we should ensure that those international students will come to the US. It means we have to study who those students are, why they choose these countries, and why we think that the United States is an alternative. So I think it's really important to be really happy with the growth we've been having and also talk about what are those characteristics and factors that we need to capitalize on in order to further outreach and recruitment in the years to come.
Good. Thank you. I'm going to ask the whole panel maybe one last question before turning to the audience for your questions. So get ready, audience, in room, and I think online. We'll be coming to you in just a moment. So my last question for you, in a similar vein, I just asked you first for some solutions. Now I'm going to ask you for some advice. So from a research perspective, what questions do we not know the answers to in terms of international education that you want the next generation of researchers to focus on answering? Or if you don't like that one, what advice do you have for people who want to either engage in working in the field of international education or move forward in the field? Do you want to go first, Carolyn?
Sure. So for people that are looking to move into this field, I think there are a lot of different directions to take. You've got some examples just from the panel today. But I think that one thing that's really important is for people who are working in international education to themselves have international education experience so that they can empathize with what students will be going through and prepare them appropriately. I know that I have worked with people who have extensive experience abroad, but also some people who really haven't had that kind of deep exchange experience, and it changes the nature of their interaction with students who are participating. So I would encourage opportunities for administrators. I would encourage opportunities for faculty, of course, as well as for students to have those experiences so that they can understand what it means to be coming from a different set of norms, a different set of educational approaches, and prepare students appropriately for that.
Thank you. This is important advice, Carolyn. Mirka.
I think we really need to focus on employability and career pathways. So this gets back to the economy question. I think, as we're seeing those numbers for OPT students go up, as we're thinking about how, to Jen's point, international students can really be international talent for skill gaps that we are going to have in this country. I think we really need to look at this more clearly and more specifically. I think it comes up against some fundamental questions around how international students come to the United States, how long they can stay, and what those education opportunities are. But I do think that's critically important, and I think we need to tackle some of those questions head on. And I'd love to see more research done about it.
It's good because we have some PhD students who might need dissertation topics in the audience here. Jen, what about you? Things we need to research that you'd be keen for folks to pick up, or let's say, advice to people who want to work in the field?
My recommendation is that we look at how we get more Americans traveling overseas and not just having a cultural experience, but a professional experience. How can we combine sort of the 3-week motor coach trip where you go around and you see, you know, the sites and you meet some students and you eat the food with an internship where they also will be having opportunities to work in a foreign workplace, to understand the cross-cultural differences between an Indian workforce and an American workforce, and to get also the experience at the different, you know, points within the supply chain that they may be working with when they return to the United States. I think having that sort of very career-oriented study abroad experience, and perhaps this is at the graduate level instead of the undergraduate level, but working that in, I think, would be a really interesting area for study, and how we can partner with the private sector to have meaningful and secure opportunities for study, work, and travel for Americans overseas as one package. Thanks.